way. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this morning about the National Institute of Standards and Technology Cloud Computing Program. I'm hoping to take advantage of the fact that we have a face-to-face forum to explain the rationale behind the cloud computing program at NIST, and to talk with you about collaboration, and to explain a little bit about how we are using that term and how it might be helpful to you in your pursuit of the cloud computing efforts. And I'd like to start by asking some questions to get to know everyone a bit. So if you could, by a show of hands, please identify whether you are representing a U.S. government agency today. State government, local government, the government of a nation other than the United States. How about a private industry consumer of cloud services? Provider of cloud services? A standards developing organization? And you can answer, you can obviously do multiple things, right? So you can answer more than once. How about industry consortia or the academic community? And then as a final question, how many are familiar with the story of the Wizard of Oz? Okay. And this, by the way, is a sequel to that. It's a 1904 edition from Frank Baum that I got in a yard sale. I wanted to focus on some of the analogies of the story of the Wizard of Oz. And I was at a meeting last week, and I heard one of the speakers say that he thought of the man behind the curtain in The Wizard of Oz with cloud computing. And that is not how I think of it. Okay? I think there are some helpful analogies, and I want to emphasize that this is not at all to trivialize the importance or the seriousness of the cloud computing paradigm, and it's not at all to give the indication that cloud computing is some sort of fantasy that cannot be attained. But I think there are some valid parallels. One is with the yellow brick road. Okay, so the road to cloud computing is not a circle that goes around where you don't get anywhere, and it's not a straight shot from A to B. It's an iterative, incremental road where, as we journey on satisfying all the requirements and adopting cloud computing, we really don't know exactly where it's going to lead us, and we don't know exactly what the challenges are going to be. Another analogy, I think, has to do with the collaboration. Dorothy and the Scarecrow, and the Lion, and the Tin Man. And one thing they have in common, although they're very different, is that they are all trying to journey to the same place, and they work together to meet and address obstacles on the way. And they have something else in common, which is that their confidence grows over their journey. So the Tin Man doesn't have a heart, but he turns out to be the one who is most empathetic and understands other point of views. The Lion thinks he's a coward. He's the one who stands up. And of course, the Scarecrow supposedly doesn't have a brain, but he's the one who helps with the innovation and who takes care of the issues along the way. And then there's another analogy with the Wizard of Oz, and this is the Emerald City. So if you are looking at this and thinking of the emerald portion as being wealth and riches, this is not the analogy to NIST. We have a very lean and just really tight set of programs, and our resources are really maxed and leveraged. If you are thinking that it's our facilities, then you obviously haven't visited. We have very sparse office conditions. We have what I think of as a dormitory tech look. And I can speak with some objectivity because I spent 20 years in the private sector, I worked for Westinghouse Northrop, building radar, sonar, spent a lot of time on the factory floor. I worked for roughly 10 years in other government agencies, including the Smithsonian, where as the Chief Technology Officer, I had an office in the Arts and Industries building, which was now condemned for use by staff and the public. Condemned is too strong a word, okay, it's being refurbished. But my point here is the analogy to NIST with the Emerald City is very different. It's in part the glasses, the Emerald City, how the people there look at things very positively. It's the industriousness of the people who work there. I am very atypical for NIST. I've been there, as I said, about a year. Most of the people who work at NIST come there right out of grad school, and they stay there until retirement. After retirement, they come back for free. And they have their own table in the cafeteria. They have their own club room in the basement with cinder block walls, and they think great thoughts. We have walls with portraits of people who, to borrow the phrase from The Wizard of Oz, think great thoughts, Nobel Prize winners. And I explain that to you because a question that I get very often when I come to a conference like this is, look, you have all those smart people at NIST. Why don't you just lock them up in a room and just leave them there until they figure out the cloud computing thing? And of course, it's not that simple. So I'd like to shift from a philosophical view to some pragmatic perspectives on cloud computing, some practical perspectives, spend about maybe 10 minutes talking about that in the cloud computing program, and hopefully have time for questions. I think many of you are familiar with the IT management reform plan that Vivek Kundra and OMB issued late in 2010. You may or may not be familiar with the cloud computing strategy that Vivek Kundra, the US CIO, issued this week. Everything that I'm going to talk with you about today relates to and is exactly the same as the NIST portion of that strategy. Consistent with our mission at NIST, which is to advance technology and innovation, the United States Chief Information Officer has asked NIST to take on a leadership role in helping US government agencies to deploy cloud computing to support their missions, to reduce costs, and to improve services. And to us, our role, our program, our goal is to identify those high priority security, interoperability, and portability requirements which must be met for US government agencies to safely and effectively deploy cloud computing. The mechanism that we are using to define those priorities and to communicate those is referred to as the US Government Cloud Computing Standards Roadmap. And we are building that roadmap collaboratively with all the stakeholders that I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk. So this is probably the most important slide in the deck from my perspective. It's where I'm going to spend the most time, because it's with our strategy and our approach that we are trying to make sure that we are not only doing good work, but that we are working on the right things. We're trying to make sure that we are staying even with the curve of cloud computing so that our work is relevant. We spent some time, again, talking to the stakeholders community that I mentioned earlier to get their thoughts and perspectives on what was needed and what would be helpful. And we came up with a cloud computing program that really has two parts. Some strategic processes that, again, drive the priorities, what we need to do in terms of security, portability, interoperability, that we then use to create the roadmap, which is nothing more than a priority list, really. And then the plan is to use that, and we are using that, to make sure that we are prioritizing our tactical work in standards, in guidance, in technology, in R&D, so again that we are working on those issues that are of most importance, not only in the eyes of our researchers and computer scientists, but in the eyes of the US government agencies and other adopters of cloud computing, and from the perspective of those who provide the technology, industry. So this is what it looks like. The first process, as we see it in the strategy, is defining target US government case studies, business case studies. And I'd like to clarify this a bit. These are not the success stories that you see published from OMB or from GSA. These are targets, opportunities for cloud where the government has, government agencies have concerns or issues or hard spots that they feel need to be dealt with. So to give you a hypothetical example, if NOAA might want to consider using a cloud computing model to be able to handle spikes in their demand for weather warning system information. But they are very sensitive to the fact that parts of the advanced weather information processing system have high and moderate security impact components. They are also very sensitive to the fact that people make life and death decisions based on weather warnings from NOAA. So there is very little room, if any, for error in meeting their reliability and performance requirements. These target business use cases are not financial cost-benefit analyses. These are technically oriented, where we are looking at end-to-end threads for the deployment and operation of cloud computing services to support missions in the US government. We see these as agency-owned. The NIST role is to facilitate the translation of these mission requirements, again, into very specific security, interoperability, portability, reliability, maintainability requirements that then translate into priorities for standards, for research, for guidance. There are two avenues that we are using to collaborate in this process. One of these is with the CIO Council, Cloud Computing Advisory Council Standards Working Group, which if you read Vivek's strategy, you'll see that NIST has the role of chair or governance for that activity. The other is with a public working group that we stood up last December, where we're involving all the stakeholders. The second piece of the process is defining a neutral reference architecture for cloud computing. There are quite a few reference architectures out there. If you've looked at them, you'll see that they're very often developed from the eye of the beholder. So if you're a storage vendor, you see cloud computing from an infrastructure perspective. If you're the Cloud Security Alliance, you think of it from the security perspective. Others may think of it from a business model perspective. Some see it as just a list of cloud services and providers. Our goal here is to define a neutral, logical, and physical representation of cloud computing that is an extension of the NIST definition, that is not tied to a particular vendor's implementation or reference model, that has room to allow for innovation in the technology, and that we can use as a frame of reference to talk with US government agencies, to categorize cloud computing services, to compare apples to apples. We see this as industry driven because that's where the technology comes from. And one thing I'd like to clarify, because this question comes up a lot, reference architecture as it's used here is not the same as enterprise architecture as it has been traditionally used in government agencies. We are not intending to define a specific set of standards or products and limit government agencies to their use. That's not the goal here. It's much higher level, much more generic. The last process is obviously exercising these scenarios against the reference architecture to identify gaps, places where we have security, interoperability, portability requirements that are not met, that can be met either through technology, through standards, through guidance. And we develop this list, the roadmap of priorities, and then use that to drive the NIST tactical work. And that's the list that you see in the box on what would be my left and I guess your right. So each of the strategic processes that you see in the strategic portion of the program, and each of the efforts that you see listed under the tactical portion of the program, for NIST represent a project, but also a working group, a public working group. And that's how we keep the synchronization and integrate the work that we learn about through collaboration and leverage that work to make sure that we're in sync overall with the broader set of stakeholders. Obviously, there are side benefits to this. You identify some of the issues that were raised this morning in terms of policy requirements, in terms of governance, and obviously it's incremental and it's iterative because the requirements change, the use cases change, the technology changes over time. So I'm going to finish up briefly with just a couple of more slides. This timeline is intended to give you a perspective, some context on the overall development of the program and where we are. The triangles that you see across the top of this chart represent cloud computing forums and workshops that NIST hosts that are open broadly to everyone. We generally have between 300 and 500 attendees. And it's a checkpoint for us, a calibration point. We developed the strategy that I just spoke to you about between the May and November 2010 workshops. Our next one is going to be hosted in April. We kicked off the working groups. We're going to report on our progress. And then our plan is to deliver the first draft U.S. government cloud computing standards roadmap at or around the end of the fiscal year. These are some statistics on the forums. You can see that later. The last thing I want to focus on is collaboration. And again, I'll do that very briefly. The working groups I mentioned are facilitated through the NIST collaboration site. And the way that works is you register for a working group. We have between 100 and 300 or so registrants for each group. The groups meet weekly through a teleconference with collaboration tools. Generally, there are 30 to 50 people who meet in each of those meetings, and they're not necessarily the same 30 or 50 individuals. We also make all of the work that we've completed formally and through the working group available through the public NIST cloud computing site if you look under useful information for cloud adopters. And some things that I will just highlight for you that I think you might find very interesting, I know that I do, are the comparison of the 10 reference architectures for cloud computing, the special publication that we issued in January on security and privacy related to cloud computing, the detailed technical use cases from SAJAC that talk at a pretty low level, speak to portability issues, interoperability, security, like how do I as a consumer get my data into a cloud provider's environment, how do I get it out? So that use case there is somewhat different than the business use cases that I mentioned earlier. So I'm going to stop here, and I don't know how much time, if any, we have for questions, but if we do, or comments, I'm happy to hear your thoughts and opinions.
Hi, Dawn. Is that working?
I'm glad I'm not the only one. Or someone, microphone.
There, now you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm Michelle Durgan from Data Probity. You and I have talked on a call because I was asking about the differences between the different use cases because I'm involved in all the groups. One of the things that came up in Kirk and Victor's business use case piece was almost a little bit of a concern about, okay, when we all got the federal strategy a week ago, or at least a handful of us through one of the subgroups, before Vivek announced it at CSA, all of a sudden GSA is responsible for use cases. And so there was an assurance, and I missed who it was that said it, but he said he was speaking to the GSA to assure that all the work that we've been doing for the last 6 weeks on the use case piece actually was going to fit through the GSA piece. How did that, not confusion, but how did the delineation between who was the authority for this versus where the work was being done happen? And how does that get synthesized?
So let me clarify that. Use case is one of those methodologies that is used very broadly. Business use cases or case studies that are presented by GSA and OMB as examples of successful cloud computing are one set of cases, not to be confused, and I admit that it is, if you're using the same terminology, it's easy to do, with the target business use cases that NIST is tasked explicitly with working with the CIO Council in developing. Now, this is a little tricky. The collaboration is tricky. NIST wears two hats. So when we go to the CIO Council meetings, which are closed only to U.S. government agencies, our role there is to help facilitate the agency's ownership of these use cases. On the other side, we also have a role and a mission to collaborate very broadly, to serve as not the mediator, but the translator, and to make sure that these use cases are considered with all cloud adopters and with industry. And that's the NIST-hosted working group that you're referring to. Which complicates it a little more is that GSA is an agency with a CIO who is standing up their own GSA agency use cases. So the word is being used quite a lot. And then the final point I would make on this, because again it comes up often, is whether or not it's feasible or practical for those who are not in the U.S. government to identify use cases, right? Because the use cases are agency-owned. And the primary purpose and the formal working group purpose is to focus on government use cases. That is not to say, as part of collaboration, that a subgroup in that group cannot define generic use cases that might be applicable broadly. Hopefully that helps it and wasn't too long.
It did, and so the public group is a more strategic use case development versus the more tactical CIO Council one that, or at least you'll take it into consideration, but the urgency is more working with the CIO, or the formality is through the CIO Council.
It's broader, but again, the primary focus of even the public use case group is to focus on U.S. government agency use cases.
Okay.
It's just different groups of people. The CIO Council is closed only to government agencies, and we're trying to work that communication role to go back and forth.
Okay, can I ask another, just, it's tied to this. I'm sure you know the team is scrambling. I mean, these are weekend and nighttime calls. Ref Arch worked all weekend for the April 7th and 8th, but everybody's got the March 31st deadline as well, just on the use case. How do you correlate those two? Because it almost, one was for the 25-point plan. Where does the 7th to the 8th workshop mandate come from for what your deliverable is for trying to roll this thing out as a draft at the end of the fiscal year, which I assume is April, right?
Fiscal year is October.
Oh, okay, so it is farther out. Okay.
September, if you want to be technical, September 30th. We set April 7th and 8th as our own deadline, quite frankly, to drive ourselves. I've talked with great admiration and respect for my science colleagues, but we need our own target to make sure that we are staying on progress and that the collaboration is productive and isn't just a series of meetings without a defined deliverable or output. The products that we are trying to generate for that, the progress we are trying to generate, is just that, to show progress. And then between the April and September time frame, that's when we'll execute more in detail and expand those products to develop the formal U.S. government cloud computing standards roadmap.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes?
Yeah, I have a quick question here. Just I have two small, simple questions. How NIST is trying to do this vendor locking, where we are paying a lot of price nowadays in the cloud thing, okay? And that is one of the artifacts for our agencies we are thinking. Like example, VMware is trying to do its own way, and Jen is trying to do its own way. Every vendor is trying to build an infrastructure as a service provider, and there is no standards clearly we are seeing. How do we agnostic about the vendors, okay, in the cloud technologies based on the NIST specifications? That's one question. And second is also just how you guys are, everybody's saying a security, we can solve it, but I'm not clearly, since we work on some such applications, we need to be, performance is one of the major artifacts of it. Security will be implemented in the layer 2 or layer 5, or we don't know clearly, and I'm trying to look at in the NIST site and trying to find those standards, but I'm not seeing any of them. Can you elaborate these two questions to me? That will be great. Thanks.
I can try, okay? So if I understand your questions properly, what I'm hearing is that you are asking for the NIST perspective on how the NIST standards efforts play more broadly with industry and with the international community as well, and particularly how you see the security requirements and solution evolving. Is that correct?
That's the second question. The first question is the vendor locking, because okay, so
okay.
that's a pretty big thing. We're paying a lot of price on that nowadays. So.
Okay, I am going to take advantage again of a face-to-face forum to share with you a discussion that I had directly with Vivek Kundra on this very subject. When we look at interoperability, portability, as well as security from the NIST perspective, what we see as being very important is that US government agencies and others have the ability to distribute their workload across cloud provider environments and move their data and systems from one cloud environment to another without lock-in. We see as being key to ensuring that that occurs is the definition of standards that will support that. That's why we have the SAIA tactical project, and right now we're focusing on data portability, candidates for interface standards. A concern that sometimes occurs when there is a misinterpretation of that objective is the thought that the government might be somehow trying to dictate the interface or the specifications of vendors within their environment, if you will. Like what happens within Google's box or Amazon's box, and I'm using box in the representative sense, not to mean a server or a particular component. We are focusing on the exchange between the vendors and leveling the playing field so that in general the government is not locked into a few particular vendors or solutions. And that's really what the whole strategy is about.
But is there any white paper or anything like that? We're not seeing anything like that. Yeah, we heard that there's interoperability on the data exchange and everything based on the NIST standards and all those things, but we are not seeing any of the real. I went last night trying to search whole NIST site, okay, trying to figure it out where these papers are. Is there anything like a real meat somewhere? Okay, so.
There is real work. I think that there is the expectation that that would be automatically in place and that all prior standards would automatically apply to cloud without the need for unique standards was not a I hate to use the word valid, but certainly not a completely valid assumption. For instance, if you look at SAIA, what we're focusing on right now is something very simple. It's like data portability. And without endorsing, but just naming two interfaces that we are focused on currently, one is the S3 data interface out of Amazon, and the other is the cloud management data interface. And that's not to say those are the only candidates. Those are just two that working group is focused on now. So going back to the philosophical piece of what I said, you can't just lock people up in a room and say, okay, come out in a week and it's going to be solved. It is a very pragmatic journey, and the only way to do it is just break the work down step by step. And again, we expect a lot of those solutions to come from industry. The security piece, and I won't dwell on it, is obviously the abstraction of the physical environment. That's where everyone focuses. These are not new data security issues. There's new visibility because of cloud, and then the complexity that's inherent in cloud and making sure that you have security across the board. And that's where we're focused. I know I've outgone my time, but
so I just am curious, what do you feel your role is as far as working with Congress on legislation, and how you are working to try to educate Congress on some of the gaps that are more legislative than regulatory or policy?
All right, I can give you a perspective on that. First of all, technology, as we see it, doesn't set policy, it informs policy. And I think that I can say that pretty comfortably on behalf of NIST. We, as do all agencies and all organizations, receive inquiries and related to particular policy questions. We support that in NIST. We support, for example, the Department of Commerce Cyber Task Force, which pulls information and recommendations from across commerce, including NIST, and responds to questions and provides positions. We, of course, have testified on cloud. Last year, Sita Furlani, the head of the Information Technology Laboratory, testified. So those are our avenues in terms of providing information. Okay. Yes, sir.
In this work structure that you've outlined, where are the business owners as opposed to the IT departments?
We can't hear you.
In the structure that you've outlined, where are the business owners as opposed to the IT components? Working with the CIO Council is great, but I never hear about it. So as a business owner, what inputs do I have into your overall arching roadmap and strategy?
That is actually very straightforward. It's directly through the working group that you register for through the TWICI. And I will say this, that in addition to just trying to focus formally on reaching out to U.S. government agencies and state agencies through the National Association of State CIOs, we do seek very explicitly the opinions and perspectives of industry, for example, the financial community. But the best way for us to make sure that your views and perspectives are included is through this working group process, because you can submit whatever you want freely as a collaborator in writing, and it's formal, it's recorded, it's really the best avenue. Okay, and I am definitely out of time. Thank you very, very much.